sick yesterday and today. So hopefully I can sit through this whole thing and not have to leave at a moment's notice, but it's possible. So yeah, I apologize in advance if I have to dash away from the computer and come back, but we'll see. Yeah, today we're going to start a new chapter. I'll get back with you guys on lab. I'll send you an email a little bit later about lab this week. It'll be online, I can tell you that much. I guess that's it. Attendance will be like it usually is when we're online like this. You're just going to have keywords. No questions for today. Even those that watch the video as opposed to who are here live. So even if you're watching this video, just do the keywords. And that's it. I guess the first keyword will be bookshelf. And still not quite 8, so I won't start yet. Larissa just got here. The first keyword is bookshelf for the online attendance. And Raven is here. One last time, or once again, the first keyword is bookshelf. All right, 8 o'clock. Let's get started. Can someone please confirm you can hear me and see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, we have to go quick. We're a little bit behind. So, either slow me down if you need to, or I think what would be better is if I'm going through this lecture, if there's anything you have questions about, maybe just jot it down and then ask me after the, visit me during office hours so I can clear things up for you. All right, so because we're in a rush, back up. Sorry. This chapter we're going to cover is called Population Ecology. And, prior to chapter 13, everything you learned about was how cells work, right? How all the things inside the cells interacted, how the genes or the genes worked, things like that. And now that we're done with that, we're learning how organisms interact with each other in nature. So with that in mind, let's move forward. The beginning of your chapter always starts off with this biology and society section that we're supposed to give you some sort of recent news story that's supposed to intrigue you and have you interested in the chapter. I'm going to skip over it because there won't be any questions about it on the exam. Basically, it's a thing about lionfish, which are an invasive species, and you're going to learn a little bit more about invasive species later in this chapter, and a little bit in the next chapter too. But anyway, the chapter itself is broken down into 4 main bullet points. First, we're going to talk about just an overview of population ecology, right? The entire subject that we're going to be discussing. Then we're going to be talking about population growth models, which is probably very handy for people who are even non-biology majors. And then applications of population ecology. And then finally, human populations growth. So this is a very relevant chapter. All right, an overview of population ecology. First thing you need to know, or the first thing you need to understand if we're going to talk about population ecology, is what a population is. And I actually defined that at the end of chapter 13. And then your book goes on to define it again in this chapter. And in this chapter, they defined it as a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. And because of this fact, that they're occupying the same area at the same time, they rely on the same resources, they're influenced by the same environmental factors, and they are likely to interact and breed with one another. So if you remember again from chapter 13, you already learned this because we were talking about how it's populations that evolve, right? Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. And, we discussed that. But are there any questions about this slide about what a population is? All right, there's questions on the study guide where it doesn't ask you what a population is. It just says, which of the following is a population? And it gives you different examples. So remember, if you get a question like that, the answer is going to be something that'll be the same species. Like, I don't know, maybe cats, right? And they're going to be living in the same neighborhood at the same time, for example, right? That would be a population. Of course, if you're talking about the population of cats and all the fleas living on their skin and their fur, that would no longer be a population because you would have just added another species to it. So it's no longer a population at that point. We'll talk about what that's called later. All right. So that being said, then what is population ecology? It is concerned with the changes in the population size and the factors that regulate populations over time. So again, we know what a population is. Population ecology is just basically how does it change? Does it grow? Does it shrink? Does it stay the same? And what's making that population grow, shrink, or stay the same? We describe populations in a few ways. You don't need to write this down yet because we'll be discussing them separately. But the three ways we describe populations are the size. I think that's the one people are most familiar with. You could say, West Virginia has 1.8 million people, right? That is the size of the population. Also, the age structure. Of those 1.8 million people in West Virginia, how many are elderly? How many are children? How many are college age students? So on and so forth. Density. That's obviously, I think, one that people are already pretty familiar with. So again, using the same example for humans in West Virginia, you could say, and I'm just making this number up because it depends on where you are, but you might say, okay, there's 5 people per square mile in West Virginia, right? Depending on where you are. So any questions about these 3 things? And again, we'll talk about them in detail coming up. All right. If you download this PowerPoint, you can watch this quick little 12-minute video on population ecology. Here's some pictures of population ecologists just doing their job. Then another term you need to be familiar with is population dynamics. And those are the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause the variation in population size. In other words, population dynamics is just looking at the things that cause the population to grow or shrink or stay the same. And these terms, I think, are new for you, at least in this course. Biotic means living, and abiotic means non-living. So, if there's a drought that hits a certain part of the world and it's there for 5 years and a lot of animals die, for example, that would be an abiotic factor that, changed the population size. An important aspect of population dynamics is population growth. So again, that's just looking at, the growth of the population. And this example down here is not from your book, but that is the growth of the human population. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. So I guess right now, the important thing on this slide would be this bullet point right here, just understanding what population dynamics are. Not that I'm going to ask you, it's just you need to understand what we're going to be discussing in this chapter, at least the beginning of it. So are there any questions so far? All right. Population ecology plays a key role in applied research. When that might be a new term for you as well, applied research. So that's when you're not just doing research for the sake of research, but you're doing research because there's a specific goal that you have in mind. Your book gives these examples. Population ecology provides information for conservation and restoration projects. And that's what this picture is right here, right? So, this is mountaintop removal. Generally speaking, when a coal company removes a mountaintop, they can't just leave it like that, right? They have to restore it. And to properly restore it and put the right amount of, species and the right species themselves, you have to understand population ecology. It's also used to develop fisheries. So if you've ever fished in West Virginia, if you have the license to fish in West Virginia, that's where this money goes, right? Especially in West Virginia, they stock the rivers with certain species of fish. And again, population ecology is important for that because you need to know how many fish do you need to put in there? At what time of year do they need to go in? All the different considerations. Population ecology also plays key roles in managing wildlife populations, which, when you think about it, is also the same as developing fisheries, but slightly different. This is a broader term. So when you think about, the DNR and how they decide, all right, this is how many deers can be killed this year in deer season. They need to be this age. You can have this many females. You can have this many males. All those things. So you have to understand population ecology to make up those rules because those aren't just arbitrary rules. And then finally, it's also used to provide insight into controlling how pests and pathogens are spread. And we'll talk about all these things a little bit later. But for now, are there any questions? All right. Long story short, population ecology is used to actually do stuff, right? It's not just a scientific pursuit. It's also used to get stuff done. So here we go. Like I said, we're going to talk about these things separately. So let's talk about population density first. It's a pretty simple concept. Population density is the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. Per unit area, I think, is what most of us are used to hearing, because again, when you're talking about humans, you would talk about square feet, right? So there's this many humans per square feet in West Virginia, whatever it may be. But that's just humans, and that's what we're used to. But you have to think about, sometimes it's also volume. So, for example, if you're talking about largemouth bass, you wouldn't be concerned with how many square feet, because that's just a two-dimensional concept. You also have to be considering, how deep. So, in other words, again, the book example, largemouth bass. If you're talking about population density, you would talk about the number of bass per cubic kilometer, right? Because that cubic, that means it's three-dimensional. It's not just a square foot. And then, of course, your book just gives a couple other examples, like oak trees per square kilometer in a forest, nematodes per square meter in a forest soil. And nematodes are basically like little worms, is the best way to describe them without giving it any more time. And, of course, humans per square mile. And if you download this PowerPoint, you can click this and watch a quick little video about the humans per square mile. So, any questions about this slide? All right. How do we measure population density? So for humans, that's pretty easy, right? Well, I won't say pretty easy, but it's very doable. In humans, we have a census, right? And we also keep track of every single human, at least in the United States, every single human that's born, every single human that dies, right? So for humans, it's very doable. But with other species, it gets a little bit more complicated, because in most cases, it's impractical or impossible to count all the individuals in a population. So, for example, if you were to look this up, and I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know if there is even an answer, but if you were to look up how many oak trees are in West Virginia, or maybe how many oak trees are in the Kanawha State Forest, you might find an answer. And it's not that someone went out and counted every single oak tree in that forest. There's different varieties of sampling techniques. Your book gives a few examples. Not that you need to know these; are just examples. But you could count the number of birds' nests, right? So if you were to, again, look up how many bald eagles are in the state of West Virginia, it's not necessarily that someone went and counted every single bald eagle, though I guess it's possible with such a small population. But they could also count the number of birds' nests, because if you're a population ecologist and you're studying eagles, then generally, how many eagles there are per nest, and also how many square miles, maybe, like of a territory that you would have for the eagles occupying that nest. Rodent burrows, that's another good one. That'll be on the picture I'm about to show you after this. But think about like trying to count prairie dogs. It's not possible to go out there and count them all unless you were to somehow capture them all. So again, if you were a population ecologist and you were studying prairie dogs, you would know generally how many prairie dogs live in each hole, and then you could just count the holes and estimate it. Anyway, the list goes on and on. But are there any questions about this slide? And there's the prairie dogs I was talking about. All right. Let's talk about population age structure. And this is the one that's probably more relevant to non-biology.
Are prairie dogs also, I mean, is it groundhog a prairie dog, or are they two like different things?
I think they're essentially the same thing. That's a good question. I really don't know. But yeah, that's a good question. They do look slightly different. But now I'm curious. Now I'm going to have to look it up. I bet they're if I had to guess, I would say they are a very closely related species, maybe even the same genus. But that'd be a good question for independent work. All right. So then population age structure. Again, this is the part that I was saying was relevant to non-biology majors, I think. The age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. Like we said earlier, it's pretty simple. Like how many old people, if we're talking about humans, how many retired people are there? How many college age people are there? How many children are there? So on and so forth. And biologically, the age structure provides a history of a population's survival. It provides history or insight into its reproductive success, and also insight into how the population relates to environmental factors. So these ideas I'll discuss in more detail on the next slide. But really quickly, I just want to say, if we're talking about humans, which we're not for the most part in this chapter, but if we are talking about humans and the age structure, that's the thing that will be relevant to the non-biology majors, right? So if you're a criminal justice major and you're living in a certain area, or let's say you've already graduated, maybe you're in the police force. The age structure would be, I would assume, pretty important, because I assume there's probably typical crimes that are committed with different age structures. Like, and I'm just guessing, but maybe there's like vandalism is more common with people under 18, and maybe drug trafficking might be more common with young adults, and maybe white collar crime like tax evasion and things like that, fraud, might be more common with older people. I don't know, but the point is, that's just one example of how age structure would be relevant to non-biology majors, for criminal justice majors. Also, anything where you're trying to decide, like infrastructure, like how many schools should we build, how many hospitals, right? That's all would be relevant to age structure. Anyway, going back to these 3 bullet points here, right? We're looking at the history of a population, survival, its reproductive success, all these things. So if you were a population ecologist and you just got to this island, let's say, and you were studying these birds, obviously, if you just started the study, then you don't have years and years of data, right? But what you could do is go out and look at the age structure, right? So let's say you go out and do your best job to get a feel of how large the population is and how old each bird is. And this is what you come up with, right? You can see there's almost 10 that are 1 year old. There's no individuals that are 2 or 3 years old. There's a large majority of them are 4 years old, and you could read the graph. But the point here is, by doing that, even though you just started studying these birds, you have an idea of some of the insight of, their reproductive success. You know that something happened 2 or 3 years ago where there was just no birds that made it, right? And you also know that 4 years ago, things were great, right? The population exploded. And you also know that 10 years ago, things were horrible, and possibly even 6 and 8 years. And like from that, you can then start studying other things, right? So maybe you could study climate patterns, look back at the records and say, okay, well, you could draw some correlations. It's like, okay, so 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a bad drought. So I now know that these birds must be very sensitive to droughts, so on and so forth. But anyway, this is just an example. That there won't be any questions about this on the exam. If anything, I might give you this exact slide, this exact graph, and say, might ask you, okay, what are a majority of the birds of what age? And you could just look at this and say, oh, well, 4 years old. Or I could say, about how many of the birds were 8 years old? And you could look at it, look at here and say, okay, that must be, I don't know, 5 or 4. So any questions about that? All right. Let's talk about life tables and survivorship curves. These are kind of related to population age structure, as you'll see. A life table tracks the survivorship, which is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages, and helps to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. So before I even ask you if you have any questions about that, let's take a look at this. So here's a life table. Here's a life table for humans. And again, it just tells you the chances. And I know this can be confusing, but if you just want to focus on the part that's not confusing, it's the numbers all the way to the left and the numbers all the way to the right, right? So we can tell that the chances, of a human being born and living to the age of 10, it's about 99.2%, right? Or the chances then of a 10-year-old making it to the age of 20, well, that's 0.996%. The chances of a 20-year-old making it to the age of 30 is 0.99%, right? So that's just showing you basically each decade what the chances are of them making it. And you should be familiar with these numbers generally, and you can see that, as you might expect, as you get older, your chances of making it to the next decade drop drastically. Now, for humans, again, that's not new information, so that's not a big deal for you. That's not groundbreaking information. But think if you were working for DNR and you're trying to decide, you're making the rules for deer season. Again, what age can be harvested, how many of them, what time when in the year can you do it? So yeah, this is why that would be important, right? Knowing what age of deer should and shouldn't be killed, because you would need to know at what age they're most vulnerable. And of course, their chart would look a lot different than ours, but just keep that in mind. So are there any questions about this slide? All right. So the survivorship curves plot the individuals that are still alive at each age and the maximum lifespan. So the last one was, basically a table, and the next one's basically a graph, and you'll see what I mean when I show it to you. But one important thing you should note before we look at it is that survivorship curves use percentages, a percentage scale, and not actual ages. And that helps because that way we can compare different species, right? So if you have a species like, I don't know, a turtle that lives to be 100-something years old, and you compare that to a species like a dandelion, which is only going to live, a year, that wouldn't be practical to do that if you were looking at years on the x-axis. But it's not years, it's percentages. So again, we've already looked at the table for humans, and like I said, most humans have a pretty good chance of surviving. And then all of a sudden, towards old age, your chances of growing to the next age group drops drastically, and that's what this graph shows. And of course, for things like oysters, it's the opposite, right? Oysters put out thousands of eggs, and most of which won't even make it, right? So, and eggs are basically baby oysters as far as this is concerned. So, the chances of you making it to the first portion of life is very slim for oysters. But then, if you do make it, your chances of making it to the next decade or the next portion of your life is much higher. I think what's most important for this slide, as far as the exam is concerned, is understanding the difference between type 1, type 3, and type 2 survivorship. Type 1 should be easy because it's humans, right? And again, for type 1, your chances of reaching old age are high, and then your chances of survivorship drops drastically after that. The opposite of type 1 is type 3, where your chances of making it at the beginning are very slim, but if you make it past there, then your chances of survival are pretty steady throughout your life. And then the one that's kind of in between 1 and 2 would be type 2 survivorship, which is where your chances of surviving is pretty much steady throughout their life. So for a squirrel, there is no vulnerable age per se. It's all pretty much your chances of surviving to the next year or whatever it may be, the next month, however you want to look at it. They're pretty steady throughout their life. So, are there any questions about type 1, type 2, or type 3 survivorship? All right. So for the exam, most likely you would get an example. So you might say something like, so the squirrel, I wouldn't use squirrels because squirrels were already used on the slide. But yeah, you might get an example and say, the individual of this species, they all live to be, there's a high chance of them living to be old. And then the chances of survivorship drop drastically after that. And you say, oh, okay, yeah, I recognize that as a type 1 survivorship. Also, something I didn't mention, but I'm going to bring this back up later too. It's not just the survivorship. There's other things that are pretty typical with these types of survivorship. So for type 1, for example, they produce few offspring that get good care. So humans, relatively speaking, provide great care to their offspring, and they don't have many of them, right? We don't think about a dandelion. Each one of those little things that, when you blow on it, goes blowing in the wind. Each one of those is a seed. Therefore, each one of those is an offspring. So they're not very well cared for. There's just a bunch of them. And again, that's type 3 survivorship. So anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. Let's talk about life history traits as adaptations, meaning, there's evolutionary advantages to being type 1, and there's evolutionary advantages to type 3, and there's trade-offs, right? And we'll talk about that here in a second. First of all, you need to know what life history is, and that is the set of traits that set the schedule of reproduction and survival. So, if you're looking at humans, you might say the humans typically able to reproduce around, 16, whatever the year may be. And then, well, I'll talk about more detail, but yeah, life history, again, you're just looking at typical reproduction, not just when they reproduce, but how many offspring they do in each litter, if you will. Anyway, the population's pattern of survivorship is an important feature of its life history. And some key life history traits include these things. And this is, sorry, what I was trying to get at earlier, and this is what you should know. The key life history, if we're talking about reproduction, right? We're looking at the age of first reproductions. We're looking at the frequency of reproduction, the number of offspring, and the amount of parental care given. And again, if you're working for the DNR and trying to determine how many fish can these people or can somebody catch, and what age can they be, and how often can you do it, and what time of the year, right? All this stuff needs to be understood to be able to come up with those rules. Any questions about this slide? All right, sorry about the background noise. Reproductive success is a key to evolutionary success, obviously. We talked about that last chapter where there was that one slide that said, used the term survival of the fittest, and that was in quotation marks because survival of the fittest is not the best term for natural selection. Because as I mentioned in that chapter, it's not just survival, it's also about reproducing. So it doesn't matter if you have traits that allow you to survive. If you're not reproducing and passing along those genes that are responsible for that trait, then you don't have, evolutionary success. And I guess that'll be the next word for attendance success. Anyway, the combination of life history traits that represents trade-offs and balanced demands for reproductive survival. Basically, because selective pressures vary, life histories are very diverse too. So again, just think about, humans. We could think a human first starts, it's more complicated because humans typically don't reproduce when we're first able to. We typically only start reproducing right around 18, right? We're adults usually. But anyway, if you were to look at that number and say, okay, typically humans might produce offspring at age 18. Usually they only have one child, per litter, if you want to call it that. Usually that child is very well cared for. And usually it would be, I don't know, maybe another year before a human would have another offspring, right? That's what we're talking about. And again, if you know that, what you're familiar with humans, then you have to think about all the other species on Earth and how they're different. Like some of them have many, many, many offspring that they get very little care, and maybe they do it a lot. Like rabbits are a great example of that. Anyway, we have words for this. So the first term you need to understand is this one called opportunistic life history. Those are the ones that take immediate advantage of favorable conditions, and they typically exhibit a type 3 survivorship. And dandelions are a great example of that. Again, each one of these little seeds, that is an offspring, right? So the chances of each one of those things turning into a full-grown plant is very slim. Most of those seeds aren't going to make it. But the ones that do make it have a good chance of survival. And again, that's a type 3 survivorship. So you could think there are trade-offs and advantages to this, right? So it takes, think about the resources put into making seeds. Your life history, you could make big seeds, fewer big seeds, so each seed has a better chance of making it, but you don't have as many seeds. Or you could have just a bunch of tiny seeds, right? And there's a trade-offs. And that's the point your book's getting at here. But are there any questions about what opportunistic life history is? All right. The opposite of that is equilibrial life history. And organisms that have an equilibrial life history, they reach sexual maturity slowly. They produce relatively few and well cared for offspring. They're typically larger bodied and longer lived, and they typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship. So you could think of just, again, the best example of an equilibrial life history is the one we're most familiar with is humans, right? It's just a good example. And then I chose these pictures. I don't think they were in your book, but I chose these pictures of these coconuts because coconuts are, again, one of those great examples of, instead of having a bunch of tiny little seeds that are not well cared for, you have fewer larger seeds, right? And they are very well cared for. Coconuts are very hardy. They can float. They've got their own liquid. Anyway, so that's just a great example, a great plant example of an equilibrial life history. Any questions about this slide? Okay. This is a good little slide to study for the exam where you can compare and contrast the different characteristics on the left-hand side with the opportunistic population example, and then the equilibrial populations example. So again, I'll just give this one example before we move forward. If we're looking at the characteristic of climate, and we're comparing, contrasting opportunistic versus equilibrial. Opportunistic, it would be very helpful, or the advantage, it would be advantageous to have an opportunistic life history where you have an unpredictable climate, meaning, your species doesn't do much, but then when conditions are favorable, boom, you're going to have a lot of offspring, like as many as you can, and just hedge your bets that maybe some of those seeds are going to make it. Right. Meanwhile, if you live in a relatively predictable climate, then equilibrial populations might be an advantage. So anyway, you should go over this, but there probably won't be any questions from the slide on the exam. Are there any questions about the slide? All right, population growth models. We're now to the second main bullet point of this 4 bullet point chapter. Obviously, you should know this, and I say obviously because you probably already do know this, but population size fluctuates when new individuals are born or move into the area, right? That makes the population size go up. And then, of course, the opposite of that would be as individuals die or move away, right? That would make the population go down. So immigration, births, and deaths, right? You already know this. That's what changes the size of a population. So models investigate how the size of a population may change over time under different conditions. And again, we're really familiar with this with humans, but for humans, it's not a good example because generally speaking, our population size isn't fluctuating. It's just skyrocketing. No matter what conditions we're in, we're kind of in charge of it. So our population is just growing older or growing faster. Now, if you think about a different population or a different species, again, using the same example, if you work for the DNR and you're in charge of turkey season, right? You want a certain amount of turkeys living in your state, and you want to allow the hunters to kill as many, or you want them to be happy with the number they can kill, right? So on one hand, you want to let them kill quite a few turkeys. On the other hand, you want to make sure that the population survives. So you have to know what the minimum is too, right? And all these things you have to understand to be able to figure out those numbers. They don't just pick these numbers randomly. Anyway, that being said, let's look at 2 different growth models. The same way you need to understand the difference between type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship, you also need to understand the difference between exponential population growth model and logistic population growth model. So let's talk about it. It's actually a pretty simple concept. Exponential growth. This is the expansion of a population in an ideal and unlimited environment, which is why I've got this picture of a bacteria. This is why bacteria grow so quickly, right? Why you get bacterial infections, because relatively, your body would be an ideal and unlimited environment. There's plenty of things to consume. So that's what a bacterial infection would be. Also, in the exponential growth model, the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents the birth minus death rate. That's just a fancy way of saying that somebody out there has figured out how many new individuals there are per generation. And that's actually right now what humans are doing. Humans are in an exponential population growth. I don't know what the number is currently, but let's just say the number was 2. That means for every generation, you multiply the population size by 2. So if it was 8, that's a bad example because it's definitely not 2. But anyway, let's say it was 2. If you have 8 billion people, then a generation next, you would have 16 billion people, right? Because you multiply it by the number 2. Anyway, if we're thinking about the growth, this population growth model, it is, I'm going to show you the graph later, but try to picture right now what the graph might look like. It's an accelerating growth that produces a J-shaped curve. And again, I'll show you an actual picture, but try to picture there's your y-axis and your x-axis, and your line is just going up. That's what I mean by J-shaped, right? The The slope shows how rapidly the population is growing. So if I were to do two different species here, and this is a different species, you could see that the one on the left is growing more rapidly than the one on the right, right? Because you could look at the slope. The steeper the slope, the quicker it's growing. This situation is common when following a disturbance. So if there's a fire or a flood or a hurricane or a drought or a cold snap or something that kills off a lot of what's already there, then you very often would see an exponential growth. Here's the picture. That's what it looks like. So yeah, you can see this is a population of rabbits, and you can see this hypothetical growth of it throughout the generations and months, even not even generations, months. So for 1 month, you may be at about 25, then maybe you're about 40, then 50. So it goes pretty quickly. But anyway, any questions about this slide? Obviously, this thing about the rabbits is just an example. I'm not going to ask you, unless I were to show you the graph, there won't be some question where it says at 8 months, what was the size of that rabbit population? Right? I won't ask you that unless I give you this slide, in which case you would look at it and say, oh, it's about 150, right? At 8 months, it's about 150. All right, so that's exponential growth model. So make sure there's no questions about that before we talk about the other of the two growth models. All right. So like we said, with the last one we were talking about, the exponential growth model, that happens when there is basically an unlimited, an environment with unlimited resources. But as you might imagine, that is not a very realistic situation, right? Most environments are not unlimited. And that brings us to a term called limiting factors. And you know what these are. Limiting factors are environmental factors that restrict a population growth and therefore control the number of individuals that can occupy a habitat. So you can think I would ask you if we had time, but I'm sure you could think of some limiting factors. Like, what are some things that are keeping this population from growing too much? Well, food, right? Once you hit a certain number of individuals, you're fighting for food, and there's not going to be an abundance of food. Places to hide, places to mate, water, things like that. So, sorry, are there any questions on what a limiting factor is? Okay, that brings us to the next term you need to know, which is carrying capacity. That is the maximum size that a particular environment can sustain. Right, so maybe, the canal, won't even give into examples yet, but that's what carrying capacity is. And then the next term is logistic growth. That is when the growth rate decreases as the population size approaches carrying capacity. So again, carrying capacity is the maximum size, right? That's basically is where you can top out at your population. And what happens is, it's not like, you've got the J-shaped curve and then boom, you hit carrying capacity, right? It doesn't happen like this. What happens is, you'll see in the next slide, as you reach carrying capacity, things actually start slowing down. There we go. So if you were to just look at this portion of the graph, like to the left, you might say, oh yeah, that's a J-shaped curve. That is exponential growth. And it was exponential growth at first. But then you get to a point where, again, you have limited resources. So maybe, you're fighting for food. Or in this case, I don't know if you've ever seen those nature documentaries with these seals, and they're fighting for a place to exist on these rocky islands, right? That's another limiting factor. And as you hit carrying capacity, things start evening out. I do like this, and I want to point this out. That red line represents what we expect of a logistic growth pattern. But what you can see here, these dots are the actual data, right? So this is real data. Somebody, followed the population size of these seals, and this is what it looks like. So the point I'm getting at here is this model, this red line is just a model. This is what is expected, but it never really falls directly on the red line, right? It's always close. Another thing to note too is what happened here is, as the population grew, it actually overshot the carrying capacity. So then at that point, obviously things are going to have to die, because now you have more individuals than the environment can sustain. So look, you can see the population dropped, and then because of that, it rebounded again. And anyway, the point here again is that red line, that's just a model. Things hardly ever go exactly as planned. Anyway, any questions about logistic growth model so far? All right, so the next slide I'm going to show you compares both of them. We're going to look at logistic growth with exponential growth. And again, like I just mentioned earlier, both of these are theoretical ideas of population growth, which is why there's the red line versus the actual black dots of data. And no natural population fits either one perfectly. But again, here we have exponential growth on the left or in the red and logistic growth in the blue. So you can see both of them on the same slide. And it really is interesting when you think about it. Technically, because nothing is limited, or because nothing is unlimited, right? Because everything is limited, you technically would not have exponential growth forever, right? So again, even when it starts off as exponential, eventually it will turn into logistic. But sometimes things happen before you can even get to that point, and we'll talk about that later. So are there any questions so far? All right. Let's talk about these unlimiting factors that we were talking about earlier. Let's go a little bit into more detail. So again, we're talking about limiting factors here, but now under that blanket term of limiting factors, there's a more specific type, and it's called density dependent factors. And obviously, as the name implies, these are limiting factors where the intensity is related to the population density. Obviously, because it's a limiting factor, it can limit the growth in natural populations. So density dependent factor, this is a good picture, right? Food, right? Because density, population density does matter. If you have a lot of individuals per square mile, for example, then your food supply is going to be very important. Or even things like diseases, right? So COVID-19 probably spreads quicker in places that have a higher population density, right? Because the disease goes from one person to the next. So obviously the higher the population density, the quicker it spreads. So again, if we're talking about density dependent factors, which is just one of the two types of limiting factors that we talk about, there's also another subcategory. So within density dependent factors, there's something called intra-specific competition. And you might need to know this for the exam. I'll put a question mark, I'm not sure. But it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple concept. It is just the competition between the same species for limited resources. And again, that's what this picture is right here. So these two wolves are competing over that piece of meat, right? So that would be intra-specific. Now, if you were to see some, lion fighting off hyenas and vultures, right? That would not be intra-specific. Excuse me. That would be interspecific, right? That would be a competition between different species. So basically, that's what you need to focus on is the intra, if it's the same species, or inter, if it's between species. And I'll come back to that concept here in a second as well. The next word for attendance is going to be sunrise. Any questions? All right. So density dependent factors can lower the birth rate and they can increase the death rate, obviously. Again, food's a great example of that. If you have a population that's starving, it's less likely that all those, if we're talking about the wolves anyway, all those pregnancies are going to make it, right? Also, if you have a population that's starving, things are going to be dying sooner and more often, right? Because they're going to starve to death. Some examples, though, that your book gives include the accumulation of toxic waste products. And we don't think about that much, but imagine, humans, if we were stuck in some kind of air sealed box, right? Somehow we could still get oxygen in, but so we're not dying from that, but you could technically die maybe if you just had too much carbon dioxide, right? That's just a bad example, but an example easy to picture. Another example would be disease transmission under crowded conditions. So again, COVID-19 would be a good example of that. Obvious ones, limited food, starve to death, limited water, you'll get dehydrated and die, and limiting shelter, right? If you don't have places to hide, places to live, places to nest, then you're probably going to be eaten or die from the elements, right? So again, for the exam, I'll probably just give you some example of a density dependent factor, and you need to recognize it as a density dependent factor. And again, the way you would do it, you think to yourself, okay, is this something that would matter if population density matters with this or not? right? And if it does, then it's density dependent. Any questions about this slide? Trying to think what I can tell you. These are just examples and won't be on the exam. But what you can see here is, though, they were looking at this population of birds, and this is the density, right, on the x-axis. So as the density increases, you can see here that the mean number of offspring per female decreases. So you might think, oh, this bird typically has 4 offspring at once, right? And it lays 4 eggs, whatever. And that's not necessarily true in this case. It depends on the density, right? So if there's a lot of birds in the same area, then these birds start having fewer and fewer offspring. And then the different, and I'll just leave it at that. I don't have time to even give the other example, but yeah, just an example. You don't need to know anything about it from the exam, but I think that's a great example of showing you how, as population density increases, in this case, you have fewer birth rates, or the birth rate decreases. Anyway, that's density dependent factors. Let's quickly look at density independent factors. Basically, if you're taking notes, you could just write down that it's kind of like the opposite of density dependent factors. This is where intensity is unrelated to density. So some examples include changes in weather or climate, right? So let's say, for example, there's some sort of weird natural catastrophe, and the state of Florida becomes like a polar area where it never reaches above 0 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Most things would just die on the state, on the peninsula of Florida, because they're typically evolved for warm weather, right? So, and that would just kill everything. It wouldn't matter if there was 5 palm trees per square mile or if there was 500 palm trees per square mile. If it got to below 0 degrees Fahrenheit at a regular basis, all the palm trees would die, right? Doesn't matter what the density dependent, or doesn't matter what the population density is. Another example would be fires, floods, storms, right? So again, a fire is just going to typically kill everything. Same with a flood and a storm. And it's important when you think about this, I would say, just not to think about humans, because with humans, you could say population density does matter, right? Because you think of like a house fire. A house fire is going to kill more people if there's more people in it, right? So humans are a good thing to not think about. But if you think about something like just a wildfire, if a wildfire in the Kanawha State Forest burns 100 acres, it's just going to kill everything in that 100 acres, right? Whether it was highly populated or barely populated, pretty much everything in that area is going to die from the fire or, leave. Anyway, any questions about density independent factors? All right. So this one kind of shows how you can have exponential growth. And in this case, because of these density independent factors, which is the fact that in this case, it probably got too hot, because look at the time frame here. We're looking at June and July, right? So the population exploded, and then all of a sudden, boom, it dropped off. So what we would expect, as you learned from earlier chapter or slides, is that you would expect it to hit carrying capacity and level off. But that's not what happened in this case, because again, there was density dependent or even independent factors that just basically caused a sudden decline in the population. That's just an example. There'll be no questions about that on the exam. So in the long term, populations are regulated by complex interactions of density dependent and independent factors. That should make sense to you, right? So it's not like a species is only dealing with density dependent or density independent factors. They're dealing with all of it. And it's just a complicated balance between the two. And that brings us to population cycles. One cycle that your book talks about is something called the boom and bust cycle. And you know that for the exam. And the example your book gives are the snowshoe hares and their main predator, which is the lynx. So their boom and bust cycles may be caused by winter food shortages from overgrazing, and predator-prey interactions, and a combination of those two. And I'll just show you the graph before I ask you if you have any questions. So the red is the predator, the blue is the snowshoe hare. So you can see here the population just explodes, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, the population drops off. And we don't know what for, or I don't. Like maybe there was starvation at that point, right? Maybe the population got so large there was just not enough food to feed them, so the population dropped. But then, because the population dropped and became small again, maybe there was more resources. So you can see here the population exploded again. But because that population exploded, so did its predator. The predator population exploded because it had a lot more to eat. So it ate them. And then probably at a certain point, the snowshoe hare population got so large that they were just really easy to kill by the lynx. So again, the hare population plummets again. And because of that, so does the lynx population, because again, it eats the hare. So again, it just goes back and forth. The point here being, you can see this is not a logistic growth. This is not exponential growth. This is some kind of different thing. It is a boom and bust where populations explode and then they crash. And then they explode and then they crash. So any questions about this? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little animation about population ecology. When we get back on Wednesday, I will be on campus. You can be on there if you want. But anyway, when we get back, we will discuss the applications of population ecology. So I guess the last word for attendance will be toy car. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, you guys have a good day.
You too.
I will be, well, like I said, I'm sick, so I might be a little bit slow to respond to any questions or emails you guys might have. So I apologize in advance, but I'll do my best.